B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Lamed Tes. We're going to start from the next Mishnah, right at the top of the Amud. Says the Mishnah, Ve'elu yerokos she'adam yoytze behen yodei chayvasoi b'Pesach. We know that besides for the mitzvah of eating matzah that we discussed in the previous sugya, be'erev toichlu matzos, on the night of Pesach, on the 15th of Nisan, during the Seder, we have to eat at least a kazayis of matzah. There's also mitzvah to eat moror. Nowadays, the mitzvah to eat moror is only midrabanon because we don't have a korban pesach. But in the time when they had a korban pesach, they would eat the korban pesach with matzah and moror. Al matzis umroirim yoichluhu, and then there was a chiyuv min haTorah to eat moror. What is moror? The Torah doesn't tell us much. It just says al matzos umroirim yoichluhu. The word moror means bitter, so we understand it means you have to eat something bitter. But what is it? So the Mishnah says elu yerokos. That's the first thing that the Mishnah is telling us, without making a big issue out of it, is that they have the status of yerokos, vegetables, not just grains. Nor are they something that comes from a tree. They are called vegetables, yerokos. The following vegetation can be used for the mitzvah of moror. So the Mishnah understands, it's not just a single species, a single type of bitter vegetable. Rather, there's a whole series of them. And the same as we saw with matzah. Matzah we saw in the previous Mishnah, that you can be yotze the matzah with a whole series of species, with the chameshes haminim. Moror also has a number of different vegetables that are all bitter enough that the Mishnah says that they conform to what the Torah says, moror. What are they? B'chazeres, b'tamcha, u'b'charchavina, u'b'ulshin, u'b'moror. These are 5 different types of moror, and we're going to see in the Gemara that the first in the list is chazeres, which is possibly the most bitter of them, certainly the most ideal and the best one to use for Seder night is called chazeres, and then the list continues. And we're not going to translate this into English because there's always the issues whether the vegetables or the contemporary names that we know them today, how they relate to those that we have in the Mishnah. So we'll just call them, as the Mishnah does, chazeres, tamcha, charchavina, ulshin, and moror. Another statement in the Mishnah, yoitzin bahen, one can be yotze any of these morors, bein lachin, bein yuveshin, irrespective of whether they are moist or if they are dry. Avaloi kvushin, but not if they have been preserved in vinegar. Veloi shlukin, and one cannot be yotze with them if they have been stewed, which typically when they've been very much cooked and boiled and stewed, then they would dissolve somewhat. Veloi mevusholin, and nor is one yotze if one cooked these morors. And in all these cases, kvushin, shlukin, and mevusholin, it's because the bitterness of the moror has already become lost. Another halacha, says the Mishnah, umitzdarfin lekazayis, that if you don't have a full kazayis, we know that in order to be yotze the mitzvah of moror, you have to eat a kazayis of moror. If you don't have a whole kazayis of any one of these species, you can make up the kazayis with a number of species together. Another halacha, v'yotzin bekelach shelohen. One can be yotze with the moror, even with the stalks of the moror. And there's a discussion whether when it says here, yotzin bekelach shelohen, how that relates to what we saw before, that one can be yotzin behen bein lachin bein yuveshin, that even when they are dry, one can be yotze. There's a discussion how that reflects on these words, yotzin bekelach, and we'll see in the Gemara. Another statement, says the Mishnah, that obviously you cannot use moror, which is osir. If you're not allowed to eat it, it's a mitzvah haba ba'avera. However, if it's mutter, then obviously one's allowed to eat it. And the Mishnah adds a chiddush, and we saw more about this in the previous Mishnah. Ubidmai, one's allowed to be yotze the mitzvah of moror with demai, which is a moror that was purchased from or attained from an am ha'aretz, and it's not 100% clear that he took all the trumas and maestros. Nonetheless, one can be yotze with demai, and in the previous sugyas we discussed this. Ubemaiser rishon shenot lo trumosoi. If the Levi had maiser rishon and he's already taken the trumas maiser off the maiser rishon, the Levi or anybody can then use the Ma'aser Rishon for Morer. Ma'aser Sheni v'hektish sheniftu, if you had Ma'aser Sheni that for whatever reason needed to be redeemed, or hektish that needed to be redeemed, and they were redeemed, then they become chulin, and one can use it for. Then the hektish becomes chulin, and you can use it for Morer, and the Ma'aser Sheni can be eaten even outside Yerushalayim as Morer. Continues, says the Gemara. Chazeres, what is chazeres that the Mishnah refers to as one of the species of Morer? Chasa. It's what was typically called chasa. Ulshin, what is ulshin? Hindavi. Tamcha, what is tamcha? Rabbi Bar Chana says that tamchasa, shmo charchavina. The name of this tamchasa is charchavina. Omar Reb Shimon ben Levi, atzavsa dedikla. That the tamcha is actually a vine that circles a date palm, and that is the morer. These tzavsasa, this vine, they are bitter and they can be used for morer. Uba morer, what is morer? Mererisa. Continues the Gemara. So far we've had one source, which is the source of the Tana of our Mishnah, with a list of 5 different vegetables that can be used for morer. Toni bar kapara, another brisa from bar kapara, which is saying Elu Yerokis. He also calls them Yerokis, vegetables. Sha'adam yetze ben yedei chayvasei b'Pesach, b'ulshin. And this is typically ulshin that are not growing wild. This is ulshin that is growing in a garden. Ubetamcha, ubecharchalin, ubecharchavinin, ubechazorin, which is chazeres. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda adds to bar kapara, but adds to the Tanakama, af ulshei sodeh. Not only the ulshin, which are the typical ulshin grown in a garden, but also the wild ulshin can also be used for morer. V'ulshei gina, and the regular ulshin grown in a garden, v'chazeres and chazeres. And here the Gemara asks, in the middle of the brisa, the Gemara asks, I don't understand. You, Rabbi Yehuda, why are you mentioning ulshei gina and chazeres as a response to the Tanakama? The Tanakama said ulshin and chazeres, and chazorin, which is chazeres. What are you adding? Ulshei gina v'chazeres, hatonulei reisha, it already says it in the Tanakama. Says the Gemara, Hachik Omar, this is what Rabbi Yehuda meant to say. Af ulshei soda, even the wild ulshin is ka ulshei gina v'chazeres, has the same status as the ulshin that are grown in a garden and chazeres, and they can be used for morer. Another Tana we have here, Reb Meir Omer, af asvas. You can also use a vegetable called asvas for morer. V'tura, and something called tura. Umar yerua. And mar means bitter, but mar yerua is also a vegetable that can be used for morer. Omalei Rabbi Yosi, asvas v'tura echotu. You, Reb Meir, said that asvas v'tura seems to be 2 species. Asvas and tura is the same. Umar zehu yerur. When it says mar yerur, then Rabbi Yosi says that the mar, something known as mar, is yerur. And there's a discussion in the Mefarshim exactly what this means. What did Rabbi Meir mean by mar yerur? What did Rabbi Yosi mean? But that's what he said. So that's already, we've had now 4 Tanoim. We've had the Tana of our Mishnah. We've had the Tanakama of bar kapara. We've had Rabbi Yehuda. We had Rabbi Meir. And now Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, another brisa, seems to be a 5th source. Eilu yerokis she'adam yotze ben yedei chayvasei b'Pesach is, number 1 is b'chazeres, u'b'ulshin, u'b'tamcha, u'b'charchavinin, u'b'charginin, u'b'hardufnin. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af chazeres yulin, v'chazeres galin k'yotze b'hen. Rabbi Yehuda adds that chazeres yulin and chazeres galin are also, you can be yotze. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Lo Omer mishum Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Lo said that he heard from Rabbi Eliezer, af arkablim. Also, arkablim can be used for morer. And he says, Rabbi Lo says, v'chazarti al kol talmidov, ubikashti li chover. I went to all the talmidim of Rabbi Eliezer to find another talmid who also heard what I did in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, that arkablim can be used for morer. V'loi matzasi, I didn't find. When I met Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he agreed to my words that according to Rabbi Eliezer, arkablim can be used for morer. So till now we've learned a list of different species, different tanoim, different species that can be used for morer. Says the Gemara, now we're going to discuss the simonim. What makes something fit the bill of morer? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kol sheyesh lo sraf, anything that has a sap, which means that when you cut it and squeeze it, then some white type of milky juice comes out of it. Anything that's got this sap is bitter and can be used for morer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Bereika Omer, kol sheponov machsifin, any vegetable whose appearance is somewhat pale. It's not very, very green like carroty, but it's a pale green color. They can be used for morer. Acherim Oimrim, others maintain, kol yerek mar, any bitter vegetable, yesh lo sraf, it has sap, uponov machsifin, and its appearance is pale green. Omer Rabbi Yochanan says, midivrei kulon, from the lists of all the tanoim we saw, whether it's our Mishnah, whether it's Bar Kapora, whether it was Rabbi Yehuda, whether it was Reb Meir, or it was Tana Debei Reb Shmuel, from the lists that they brought, Nilmad, we can learn that yerek mar, a bitter herb, is yesh lo israf, it has sraf, uponov machsifin, and their appearance is pale green, because all the things in the list, they have sap and are pale green. Omer Rav Huna halacha k'achirim. Rav Huna says that that's the halacha like achirim. Continues the Gemara. Ravina ashkachel Rav Acha b'rei derava. Ravina found that Rav Acha b'rei derava dehava mahader amarirta. He was looking for the vegetable called morer, for the herb called morer. Omer lei. So Ravina asked Rav Acha, "My datech, why are you looking especially for morer? The meririn tfei, is it because they are more bitter than all the rest? V'hachazeres tnan." If you look in the Mishnah, the first thing on the list, presumably because it's the most bitter, is chazeres. Morer is actually the last on the list. But Tana Debei Shmuel, chazeres. If you look in the Tana Debei Shmuel that we saw, he also puts chazeres at the first on the list. Va'omer Rabbi Oishia also said, mitzvah b'chazeres, the most ideal herb, vegetable to use for morer is chazeres. Va'omer Rav, and Rav now explains, my chazeres, what is chazeres? Chasa. It's chasa. My chasa. Why is it called chasa? Why is this chazeres also called chasa? The chos rachmonu ilavon, Hashem, the merciful one, had pity on us. The word for pity is chos. V'omer Shmuel bar Nachmeni, Omer Rabbi Yonason. Shmuel bar Nachmeni adds in the name of Rabbi Yonason an added point. Lama nimshlu amitzrim kamorer. Why are the Mitzrim calls compared to morer? The pasuk says, "Vayimoreru es chayem." They bittered our lives. What do they have in common with this vegetable called morer? To tell us ma morer zeh, in the same way as this morer, shetkilosei rach, at the beginning when it starts growing, the stalk is soft. V'soifei kosher, and afterwards the stalk becomes very hard. Af Mitzrayim, so to the Mitzrayim tchiloson raka. At the beginning they persuaded Klal Yisrael to work for them even for pay. V'soifon kosher, at the end they were very harsh. So based on all this, Ravina is saying to Rav Acha, why are you looking for something called morer? You should be looking for something called chazeres and chasa. Omar Le Rav Acha said to Ravina, Hod Rabbi, you're right, I retract that, and in the future I'm going to look for chazeres. Continues the Gemara. And now we're going back to basics. What is morer? The Tana of the Mishnah assumes it's a vegetable and it's bitter. So we understand it's bitter. It's called morer. But let's see, where do we know, or says the Gemara. Who told the Mishnah that morer has to be a herb, has to be a vegetable? Ema Merirta de kufya, when the pasuk says al matzis umroirim yechlu, something bitter, maybe it's the gall, which is very bitter, of a fish called kufya. Answers the Gemara, dumya de matzah. The pasuk says al matzis umroirim yechluhu. It puts matzah and morer in the same pasuk to compare the two. Ma matzah, in the same way as matzah is gidulei karka, something that grows from the ground, af morer gidulei karka. Morer must be something that grows from the ground. That's the first thing we know from the fact that it's compared to matzah. It's not some gall of fish. Ve'ema hirdoif. Maybe it's something that comes from a tree, not a vegetable. It's something that comes from a tree, a very bitter tree called hirdoif. The Pasuk makes mention of this when Moshe Rabbeinu there was a tremendous nest when Moshe Rabbeinu took a bitter piece of wood and put it into the water that was bitter, and the water became sweet. And which bitter wood did Moshe Rabbeinu use? The hirdoif. So maybe morer is hirdoif, not these vegetables. Says the Gemara again, dumya de matzah, it's compared to matzah. Ma matzah means roim, in the same way as matzah is a type of a herbage, it's a type of a grain, it's not something that comes from a tree. Af morer, so too, means roim. It has to be a type of a herbage, a vegetation, not something that comes from a tree. Asks the Gemara, ve'ema harzifu. Maybe it's this plant called harzifu, which is bitter, and it's typically used to kill. It's a poison that kills animals. It's not usually eaten by people, but it obviously is edible at a push. You could eat it, but it's not normally used to be eaten by people. But maybe that's what morer means. It's a plant, it's not a tree, it grows on the ground, it's bitter. Maybe that's what the Torah meant. Says the Gemara again, dumya de matzah, similar to matzah. Ma matzah, in the same way as matzah, shenikachas bekesef meiser, it's allowed to, or anything that matzah can be made of, are food items that typically are bought from the money of Meiser Sheni. Meiser Sheni, the money of Meiser Sheni must be used for food items in Yerushalayim. So, af morer, so too morer, shenikach bekesef Meiser, it has to be a type of food that could be bought with the money of Meiser Sheni. And since this harzifu is not regularly eaten, it cannot be bought with the money of Meiser Sheni, hence it cannot be used for morer. Continues the Gemara, Omali Rabbi bar of Chonin Labaya. Ema morer chad. Okay, so we know that morer is a type of vegetable, and let's assume it's one of those mentioned in the lists we have. But who told you that morer could be one of many vegetables? Maybe it's the one most bitter vegetable that exists. That is morer. What made you think, who told you that you can choose from a list? Answers the Gemara, meroirim ksiv. It says in the Pasuk, al matzos umeroirim yoichluhu, that you eat the Pesach with meroirim, with bitter things, in plural. There must be more than one. Ve'ima meroirim trei, maybe just two. Meroirim is plural. Plural could be two. In the Mishnah itself we have 5, and we have a whole bunch more in the Tanoim in the Gemara before. Answers the Gemara, dumya de matzah. Again, we use the comparison of al matzos and meroirim yechluhu to compare morer to matzah. Ma matzah minim harba, in the same way as matzah, it's any of a number of species, as we saw in the previous Mishnah. Af morer minim harba, so too morer can be a choice of many species. Continues the Gemara. Omar Rabbi bar Avuna Omar Rav. These vegetables that we saw in, let's say, the ones we saw in the Mishnah, chazeres, tamcho, charchavina, ulshin, and morer, they are kulon nizroin ba'arugo achas. We know there's a halacha of kilayim. This is not a Pesach connected halacha. There's a halacha in the fields with kilayim. You're not allowed to plant a number of different vegetations too close to each other, where they are drawing nourishment from each other and from the same piece of earth in between them. When you have different vegetations, they have to be far enough apart. Now Rav here tells us that the 5 species that can be used for morer, let's just relate to the Mishnah. The 5 in the Mishnah, they are considered as a single vegetable, and they can all be planted together in the same bed. A bed is an area somewhat enclosed, but it's an area of land, of earth, within which vegetation was planted, and in a single bed one is allowed to plant all these types of morer. It's considered as one vegetable. It's not kilayim. Says the Gemara, Lememra de lesbu mishum kilayim. Are you suggesting that there is no issa of kilayim between these 5 species, and it's considered as a single vegetable? Mosiv Rava. Rava's questioning this. How can you, Rav, suggest such a thing? It said there's an explicit Mishnah, Chazeres v'chazeres galin, Ulshin v'ulshei sode, Krishin v'krishei sode, Kuzbar v'kuzbar sode. And to interrupt, this price is telling us pairs of vegetables, where you've got the standard vegetable, for example, the chazeres, which is the standard chazeres, and then you've got chazeres galin, which is a chazeres with an added name, because it's a little bit different. There's something different about it, that's why it's given an added name. So it's obviously two things, chazeres and chazeres galin. But over here, in this context, chazeres is a pair with chazeres galin. Same with ulshin and ulshe soda. You've got the ulshin that grows in the gardens, you have ulshin that grows wild. Then, even though there is some difference between them, they are a pair. Krishin v'krishe soda, kuzbar v'kuzbar soda, chardal v'chardal mitzri, mustard and Egyptian mustard, dalas, hamitzri, an Egyptian gourd, v'harmutza, which is another type of gourd, another type of dalas. These pairs, einam kilayim zeh b'zeh. Each pair is a single vegetable and they can be planted together. So that's what it says in the Mishnah. So the Gemara is deducing from there, Rava is saying, chazeres v'chazeres galin in, that these are pairs, that chazeres and the different type of chazeres, they are considered one. Chazeres v'ulshin loy. But there's no indication there that you're allowed to plant chazeres with ulshin. Those are two different types. Coming back to our Mishnah, the Mishnah says chazeres is one type of morer, ulshin is another type of morer. How can you, Rav, say that all the types of morer can be planted together? V'chitema, are you going to suggest kulhu bahadi adodi? That the whole Mishnah we just mentioned, it's not pairs, chazeres with chazeres galin, one pair, ulshin and ulshe soda, another pair. Are you suggesting the Mishnah is one long list, that chazeres and chazeres galin and ulshin and ulshe soda, etc., the whole list, they could all be planted together? Is that what you're suggesting? You Rav? Va'omar Rav explicitly said, zugois ktoni. The way to read that Mishnah is in pairs. Each pair is not kilayim, but one pair and another pair is two different species and will be kilayim. So how can you, Rav, say that the Yerokis, She'omru Chachomim, all the morrows can be planted together? They can't be planted together. Chazeres is one type, ulshin is another type, just for an example, and two types are not allowed to be planted together. Answers the Gemara, mine is roin to Omar Rav, when Rav said that these vegetables, the Yerokis, She'omru Chachomim, She'adum Yitzchok B'midei Chavosei B'Pesach, Kulon is roin baruga achas, they can all be planted in a single bed. You know what he meant? He didn't mean they could all be planted on top of each other, right next to each other, adjacent to each other, and even though they're going to take nourishment one from the other and from the land in between them, they're both going to take from the same land. And that would only be permitted if they are the same species. No, what he meant was Nizroin Kahil Chason. You're allowed to plant all of these, but conforming with the distances that one would conform with vegetables, that there's a gap between one type and another, a sufficient gap that they should not be nourishing one from the other. Says the Gemara, Kil Chasam? Do I need Rav to tell me that when you have different vegetables, these vegetables that can be morers, do I need Rav to tell me that these different types of morers, when you plant them, you have to leave sufficient distance between them? Tanina, it's explicit. It's an explicit Mishnah. Aruga, which is a bed where vegetables are sown, are grown. Shahi shisha al shisha tvachim, if this area where the plantation is taking place is 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim, zoirin b'stoicha chamisha zir'oinim. You're allowed to plant in this area 5 different species of plants, of plantation. Arba al arba ruchos, 4 different types, one on each side. There's 6 tvachim in between them. Arba ruchos aruga, v'achas b'emtza, and one in the middle. So if you have one in the middle and one on each side, you have sufficient distance between them. So I don't need Rav to tell me that you have to keep the distance between the different morors. That's what it says in this Mishnah. Says the Gemara, no. I may have thought, Hanamili, when is the Mishnah talking about that you need to have within 6 tvachim by 6 tvachim, you can have a maximum of 5 plants, one on each side and one in the center? That's only bizroim with grains. I will be rokis, but vegetables that are not grains, vegetables that are typically plucked whilst they are whole vegetables. Loi, maybe over there you need an even greater, even larger distance between them, and that's what Rav would be And that's what Rav is telling us. No, Kumash Malon, that the same that applies to this bed, that this Mishnah that says that Shisha al Shisha Tfachim, then you can have 5 Zaroinim, you can plant 5 plants in it, the same applies tomorrow. You don't need an even larger distance than what it says in this Mishnah. The Gemara continues to ask against Rav. So you, Rav, are telling me a Chiddush. This Mishnah may only be speaking about grains, and you, Rav, are telling us that the same applies even to vegetables, to Yerokos, where Yerokos, they draw nourishment from even a wider area than grains, and you're telling us that the same applies. You can conform to the same distances as it says in that Mishnah. Says the Gemara Lememra, so you, Rav, suggesting the Yerokos alima mizroim, that vegetables, they draw their nourishment from an even wider area than grain? Votnan, seems to be against the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Kol minei zroim, ein nizroin ba'rugo achas. When it comes to grains, you're not allowed to plant any 2 types of grains in a single bed. Kol minei yerokos. It's only regarding yerokos vegetables that zoirin ba'rugo achas, that are allowed to be planted in a single aruga. So the Mishnah that tells us, arugo shi shisha al shisha tfochim, zoirin b'toicha chamisha ziroinim, must be talking about only Yerokos. And again, if so, you, Rav, what are you coming to teach me? The Mishnah is talking about Yerokos because regarding grains, it's not even true. You're not allowed to plant more than 1 grain in a single bed. So it's talking about vegetables. So what you, Rav, telling us that all the moros are allowed to be planted kahil chason, keeping the distance. Well, that's what it says in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, no. I may have thought hanim moror means roim ninu. We may have thought that the morors, all these different types of moror, are actually a type of grain, a type of zroim, and they are not in the same bracket as Yerokos. So Rav is saying, no, you're allowed to plant them in the same bed if you keep distance, and he's teaching us that the morors have the status of Yerokos, Kumash Malon. That's what Rav is teaching us, that the morors are considered vegetables. Asks the Gemara, Zroim Sol Kadaitach, would anyone have thought that these types that mentioned in the Mishnah or mentioned in the Tanoim before are Zroim? They are types of grains? V'hotnan, look in the Mishnah, the first word in the Mishnah, second word, Elu Yerokos. The Mishnah says explicitly, these are vegetables, and then mentions the 5 types of moror. V'toni bar kapora, look in the brisa we saw from bar kapora. Yerokos also mentions vegetables. V'toni debei Shmuel, look in the brisa we saw from debei Shmuel, also Yerokos. So everybody knows it's Yerokos, and we all know that with Yerokos, the Mishnah says that these are the distances 6 by 6 tfachim, you can plant 5 different types in it. What are you, Rav, coming to teach us? Says the Gemara, you're right. And Rav has got one last chiddush to teach us. Chazeres, it's trichale, it's only regarding chazeres. I may have thought, since the stalk of this chazeres becomes very, very stiff as it matures, I may have thought you need to give it even more gap, more empty space around it, because it draws its nourishment from an even wider area. Lav Omer Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, did Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina not say that kelach shel kruv, the stalk of a cabbage, shehukshu, that became very, very hard and stiff, marchivin loy beis roiva, you have to expand the empty area around it to an area of a beis roiva, which is just over 10 amos by 10 amos, approximately. Alma, kivan de soifei lehakshis, yavinon le rav chetfei. So you see from what Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina said, that if something gets hard, then the halachas change regarding kilayim. So I may have thought that this chazeres needs a much wider area and cannot be planted in the same 6 by 6 tfachim with other types of moror. Kamash Malon, that's what Rav was saying. No, they're all allowed to be eaten, but all allowed to be planted in a single aruga of 6 by 6 tfachim, as long as you keep to the distances mentioned in the Mishnah at the beginning of the Amud. Then that's what Rav is saying, that even the chazeres can be planted there with the other morors. Continues the Gemara. We saw in the Mishnah, Yotzin Bohen, one can be Yotza, the mitzvah of Moror on Leil Pesach, with any of the Morors, Bein Lachin, Bein Yoveshim, irrespective of if they are dry or if they are still moist. Omer of Chisda. Rav Chisda said, Lo yishonu, that's only true, elo bekelach, only regarding the stalks of the morer. Aval ba'alin, but the leaves of the alin, lachin in, if they are moist, they still taste bitter, you can use them for morer. Yeveshim, but once they dry and they just taste of nothing really, just of earth, of like the taste of nothing, they don't have the bitterness in it anymore. Lo, you cannot use dried up leaves of the morer for the mitzvah of morer. Asks the Gemara of Midiktoni Sefer Bekelach Shelahem. Going back to the Mishnah, first the Mishnah made a statement, Yotzin Behen Bein Lachin Bein Yeveshim, etc. And then the Mishnah said, V'yotzin Bekelach, and you can also be Yotza with the stalks. It would seem from there, says the Gemara, Midiktoni Sefer, since a further statement in the Mishnah says, Bekelach Shelen, you can be Yotza with the stalks, Michlal, it would seem, Dereisha Alin, that at the beginning, when the Mishnah talks about that you can use morer dry and moist, is not talking about the stalks, is talking about the leaves. And then it would be clear in the Mishnah that you can be Yotza with dry leaves, contrary to what Rav Chisda said. Says the Gemara, no. Perusha komefarish. The Mishnah is not adding on something new that you can be yotza with stalks. No. The Mishnah is explaining. Kik toni, when we said a couple of lines earlier in the Mishnah, bein lachin bein yeveshim, that you can be yotza morer, whether they are dry or moist. Akelach, that's only talking about the stalks. But are you to choose to eat the morer from the leaves? It has to be moist and not dry. Asks the Gemara Meisvei. Yotzin bohen bekelach. So we have here a brisa. The brisa says that you can be yotza the mitzvah of morer. Yotzin bohen, you can be yotza with them, meaning the leaves. Ubekelach shelahen, and with the stalks. That's one point to note in this brisa, that you can be yotza with either leaves or stalks. And the brisa continues, bein lachin bein yeveshim, both if they are dry, if they are moist. Divrei Reb Meir, that's the opinion of Reb Meir. The Chachomim say, obviously referring also to the stalks, also to the leaves, lachin yotzin behen, yeveshim ein yotzin behen. The Chachomim say that even if you have a stalk, if it's dry, you cannot be yotz the mitzvah of morer. V'shavin, but Reb Meir and the Chachomim both agree, sheyotzin behen, that you can be yotza with morer, k'mushin, if they are somewhat withered, it's okay. It's still moist, it's still morer, it's still bitter, you can be yotza. Aval, but not in the following cases, as we saw in the Mishnah. Not if they are kvushin, if they've been preserved in vinegar, v'lo shlukin, not if they've been almost dissolved because they've been stewed, v'lo mevusholin, and not if they've been cooked. What's the rule? Kol sheyesh bo itam morer, anything that still has the bitterness of the morer in it, yotzin bo, you can be yotza. V'chol she'ein bo itam morer, but anything that doesn't anymore have the taste of the morer, ein yotzin bo, you cannot be yotza. So that's the end of the brisa. But what do we see in this brisa? We see in the brisa, number one, you see that there is an opinion in that means according to the Chachomim, you cannot be yotza with anything that's dry, not leaves and not the stalk. So if in our Mishnah it says that yotzin bein lachin bein yeveshim, you can be yotza irrespective of whether they are dry or moist, it must be that our Mishnah is following the opinion of Reb Meir, because according to the Chachomim, even the stalks, if it's dry, you're not yotza. Well, if our Mishnah is the opinion of Reb Meir, the Reb Meir says in this brisa explicitly that bohen ubekelach shelohen bein lachin bein yeveshim, that even the leaves itself, not only the stalk, you can be yotza, not only if it's moist, even if it's dry. And that's not like Rav Chisda. Answers the Gemara, tirgemo akelach. The way Rav Chisda is going to read this brisa is as follows. Yotzin bohen, you can be yotza with the leaves, ubekelach shelen, and with their stalks. And now the brisa is continuing. This is how Rav Chisda understands it, that when it says that you can be yotza with the kelach, with the stalks, it's bein lachin bein yeveshim, even if it's dry, not only if it's moist. However, if it's bohen, if you're being yotza with the leaves, then it has to be moist and it cannot be dry. That's how Rav Chisda is going to have to read this brisa. Continues the Gemara. Tonu Rabbanon, ein yotzin bohen kmushin. We saw in this previous brisa that you are yotza if the morer is kmushin, if it's withered. Here in this brisa, the Tanna Kama says that you are not yotza if it's withered. Mishum Rabbi Lezer ben Tzadik Omru, yotzim ben kmushim, he argues and says that if it's withered, you can still be yotza the mitzvah of morer. Continues the Gemara. Boya Romi Bar Choma. We've discussed in the previous sugya, no need to repeat it all again now. There's a concept of Maisa Sheni that has to be taken to Yerushalayim and eaten there, B'Kedusha, B'Tara. What happens if somebody has got Maisa Sheni and is choosing to use this Maisa Sheni, which happens to be one of the types of morer, he wants to eat it on Leil Pesach, to be Mekayim, Mitzvahs morer. Can he do that or not? So, according to Rabbi Akiva, and now we have to backtrack to the Gemaros we saw previously on Daf Lamed Vav. We saw there that regarding matzah of Maisa Sheni, there was a machlokes Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you cannot be yotza the mitzvahs matzah with Maisa Sheni, because he says that matzah is called lechem oini, and it has to be eaten. You have to eat matzah with something that can be eaten even ba'oini, as in oini with an aleph, whilst grieving, and Maisa Sheni is not allowed to be eaten in a state of oinon. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you cannot be yotza with Maisa Sheni. How about Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva argues, and he says matzah is riba. Even though Rabbi Akiva says that you cannot be yotza with bikurim, because bikurim cannot be eaten in the whole of Eretz Yisrael, only in Yerushalayim, and Maisa Sheni also can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. However, there is a situation where Maisa Sheni could be eaten outside Yerushalayim. For example, if it became tomei, then it could be redeemed, and then the original Maisa Sheni can be eaten outside Yerushalayim. Therefore, we allow ourselves to, or the Torah allowed itself to learn from the word matzos, the extra word, the extra letters, to teach us that matzah of Maisa Sheni, you're allowed to be yotza the mitzvah. The question now is, what's with morer? So the Gemara says, Alibad Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, who says that even the mitzvah of matzah, you could, not even, Rabbi Akiva, who says that the mitzvah of matzah, you can be yotza with Maisa Sheni, lo yitzboy lecha. There I'm taking it for granted that you can be yotza, according to him, even with morer. Why? Hashta b'matzah do'iraisa, the Maisa Sheni of grains is min haTorah. However, the Maisa Sheni of vegetables is only a chiyuv midrabanon. So he says matzah that comes from grains, that it's Maisa Sheni min haTorah. That means min haTorah, you're not allowed to eat it outside Yerushalayim, and the only reason that you're allowed to be yotza matzah with it is because if it were to become tomei, then you would be allowed to eat it outside Yerushalayim. Nofik, you can be yotza the mitzvah of matzah. Then regarding morer, which is a vegetable, derabonon, that the whole concept of Maisa Sheni by vegetables is only miderabonon, and min haTorah it's not Maisa Sheni, and min haTorah you can eat this morer in the whole of Eretz Yisrael. It's only the Rabbanon said take Maisa Sheni from vegetables. So miderabonon you're not allowed to eat this morer outside Yerushalayim. But if even matzah where it's Maisa Sheni min haTorah, you can be yotza mitzvah of matzah, of course morer you can be yotza the mitzvah. Morer derabonon miboya, of course you can. Kita boyalach, who am I asking you? Alibad Rabbi Yossi. According to Rabbi Yossi, who says that you cannot be yotza the mitzvah of matzah with Maisa Sheni, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, what's the halacha? B'matzah do'iraisa hu deloy nofik. Maybe only regarding matzah, which is Maisa Sheni min haTorah, he says you cannot be yotza the mitzvah of matzah. Aval morer derabonon, but morer which is only Maisa Sheni miderabonon, maybe nofik, you are allowed to be yotza the mitzvah of morer with it. That's one way of looking at it. Oy dilmo, maybe no. Kol the tiknu rabonon k'enteraisa tikun. Whenever the Chachomim made the takana, they did it with the similar parameters as that of the similar Issa min haTorah. And since the Rabbanon said, make vegetables Maisa Sheni, take Maisa Sheni from vegetables, they have the same status as Maisa Sheni min haTorah, and in the same way as matzah, which is Maisa Sheni, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you cannot be yotza, so too morer you cannot be yotza. That was the question. Omar Rava says, Mistabra matzah or morer. Again, coming back to the pasuk, Al matzah isum roirim yoichluhu, we compare matzah to morer. If in its matzah state, if it's Maisa Sheni, you cannot be yotza, so too with morer, if it's Maisa Sheni, you cannot be yotza the mitzvah of morer. In the next shiur, we're going to continue the next Mishnah.